Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with things. So I just want to say good morning to everyone. The Mobile County Public School System, school counselors who volunteered to serve on our crisis intervention team. Thank you so much, one, for volunteering to serve on the crisis intervention team. And at this point right now, as we were setting up and scheduling this training, it was strange enough that we actually had it during 9/11. So at this time, we want to give a moment of silence because it was on September 11th, 2011, that our country was devastated by all that were killed in the attack in New York, as well as in Washington, D.C. So at this moment, we would just give a moment of silence. Thank you. Okay, and so speaking of crisis, I'm so thankful that we have, once again, that we're partnering with Lifelines Counseling Center, but looking at our facilitator today. We have with us, our facilitator is Laury Rowland. And so Laury is the Rape Crisis Center Program Coordinator, which is a division of Lifelines Counseling Center. And so Laury has experience, so much experience in dealing with crisis situations. And she's done lots of training too as well. We're glad to have Hillary Rodriguez with us too as well, who's serving on the technical side of things. And so she's one of the Rape Crisis Center, one of the victim advocates. So we're glad to have Hillary here with us too. But Laury has done training just across our community and training on crisis and how to respond, even with law enforcement. And so we know that this is valuable, this particular committee. Unfortunately, we do have crises that happen during the school year. If we just reflect back to last school year, we had to deploy our crisis intervention team to schools. We've had the death of a faculty member. We've had the death of students. We've had a shooting that was done at a school event, which we had to deploy our crisis intervention team. So this training is just to really help us to focus on, because during a crisis, so much is happening, but focusing on the essential components that are needed for us to be helpful in being an intervention for our students and our faculty and staff. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Laury, and thank you so much. Laury, you can take it away.
Thank you very much. Okay, good morning, everyone. Like Dr. Motley said, my name is Laury Rowland, and I am the program coordinator for the Rape Crisis Center. Hillary Rodriguez is also with me, and I couldn't do it without her. She's kind of like the great and wonderful Oz behind the screen, making sure that I don't implode trying to do all of this virtual stuff, because it's a little new to me. I prefer face-to-face training very much. But unfortunately, we're not able to do this with our new normal. So thank you, Hillary, for being my Vanna White, if you will, and being able to change the slides around for me and everything like that. I do appreciate that. It's interesting that Dr. Motley talked a little bit about 9/11 this morning, because over the last couple of days, as I was preparing for this training, I was thinking about crisis intervention and how ironically this training was scheduled for, it was originally scheduled for a different date in August, but I wasn't able to accommodate that date. So she scheduled it for 9/11, and I don't know if that was on purpose or if that was just a coincidence, but I'd like for you to think back to where you were and what you were doing on 9/11, 18 years ago, when our whole way of thinking, our whole way of safety, how we responded to crisis, how we responded to trauma, how that changed over the past 18 years and how things look like. So unfortunately, because we're not face-to-face, I can't kind of gauge everyone's reactions and hear what people are thinking and what they're saying. based on what they're remembering was happening in their life 18 years ago, but I wanted to share with you what I remember from that date. 18 years ago, I was in a classroom. I taught special ed in a school district in Missouri, and I very vividly and very distinctly remember our principal coming over the intercom system and asking all faculty and staff to check their emails. And I opened up my email and was taken to a link and was seeing what was going on in the world and what was happening in the world. And it wasn't but maybe 10 minutes after that our phones started to ring, and I had a phone in my classroom. As a special ed teacher, we had phones in our classrooms, and I had a phone in my classroom, and it started to ring, and it was parents, and they wanted to know if they could come and pick their children up. There were parents coming to the school, bypassing the main office and just going to the classroom and getting their kids out. And it was a very chaotic situation. And it was maybe one of the first times that we had experienced that type of massive crisis across the board. And we were seeing crisis intervention teams deployed at ground zero and in schools and in hospitals and in all over our country. Folks were coming together and helping each other deal and cope with what was going on during that crisis, massive crisis event of 9/11. And so it just made me be very mindful in how I wanted to kind of proceed with this type of training. Because when we talk about crisis or crisis intervention, we obviously need to talk about crisis. We need to talk about trauma and how the two intersect. And we really can't talk about one without the other. And I talked with Dr. Motley just a little bit about kind of what she envisioned and what her hopes were for this training, and not knowing what everybody's comfort level was with crisis and trauma, not knowing where your personal experiences were, if you've been deployed out prior to this training, if you're a new hire to the district, or if you're a new hire to the career of education. So not really knowing where everyone was. We're going to kind of start at a basic level and kind of move forward into not just understanding what crisis and crisis intervention is, but talking a little bit about trauma and what trauma looks like, and how we as that team of people that go out and help in those dark spaces and places, how we understand what trauma-informed and victim-centered care is, because I think that's really the crux of what we're talking about. In order to be an effective team member on a crisis intervention team, I think it's so important that we understand what trauma looks like, because it looks different for everyone. And we'll go into that a little bit in today's training. And then I want to talk a little bit about just some de-escalation skills, some verbal de-escalation skills, what we can do to kind of help mitigate a situation before it becomes into an explosive situation that we may not be able to handle on our own. Then we're going to wind the training up with a little bit of self-care. What you all do is very difficult, not just teaching, and not just teaching during a pandemic and how all of that looks and how that's different, but just what we can do to take care of ourselves, and some things that we can watch for to make sure that we are not experiencing vicarious trauma, making sure that we aren't getting burned out or having stress-related type issues because of the stress and the trauma and the crisis that we deal with every day in our work. So I say all of that to just kind of preface what we're going to be doing this morning. So Hillary, if you would go ahead and start the PowerPoint for me, we will get started. I think we'll take questions at the end. There should be plenty of time for a Q&A discussion if anybody has anything that they want to talk about. I'll make sure that there's ample time for that. All right, whenever you're ready, Hillary, we can go ahead and start the PowerPoint.
All right, that pulled up now.
Okay, we'll just go ahead and go on to the second slide, if you don't mind, Hillary. And I think before we can talk about establishing a crisis intervention team or what crisis intervention is, we really need to talk a little bit about what a crisis is. And like I said, some of this may be very basic information to some of you or maybe to all of you, but it's never a bad idea to kind of have a refresher. So a crisis is an emotional distress that comes about from a situation that can be developmental, it can be biological or psychological. It can have all of these different factors in it. So basically what's happening is that we are becoming distressed in a manner to where we are not able to cope. Our normal go-to coping mechanisms our normal resources that we would normally rely on in a non-crisis situation. We just are not able to rely on those any longer because of that crisis. Crisis can be perceived as trauma. It can be something that we either experience. It can be something that we witness. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that we experience firsthand. It could simply be something that we have witnessed. And based on our life experiences, based on things that have happened to us, is definitely going to depend on what that level of trauma looks like for us, or what that level of crisis looks like for us, and how we're going to respond to that trauma. Next slide. So I've got a question up there: a crisis or a trauma? And really, I think that the intersectionality between the two is very unique, because you can't really talk about a crisis without also talking about trauma. And you can see on the screen, there's a list of different things. And Dr. Motley talked about a school shooting. She talked about the death of a faculty member. She talked about the death of a student. So based on our life experiences, these types of crises can create significant trauma in our life. And any of those things on the list, from a traffic accident or the death of a student, or even a student that may be having suicidal ideations, depending on what that life experience is going to depend on how we respond to these different types of traumas. And obviously this isn't a complete list of things that could be considered a crisis that cause trauma, but these are things that most of us in the line of work that we would do would be seeing. Next slide. When we talk about crisis intervention, basically this is a method that uses to offer immediate, short-term help to an individual who's experiencing an event that produces emotional, mental, and physical or behavior distress. So we want to do whatever we have to do in that immediate moment to try to relieve some of that stress and try to get that person back to a pre-crisis state. Next slide. There are some core components when we talk about crisis intervention. A crisis is any event that causes extreme stress, fear, or terror. It's an event that leads to feelings and emotions that are overwhelming and confusing. And like I said earlier, these feelings of being overwhelmed or being confused are intensified by our own life experiences. So perhaps you have a student that maybe has experienced a death by suicide from a family member, or somebody that they know has died by suicide, and they have a friend in school that maybe is expressing some suicidal ideations. Just hearing that friend express those types of things could be traumatic enough, just that in that moment right there, and it could cause them to go into crisis. So anything that we feel is overwhelming or is confusing can very much be intensified by our own personal life experiences. It's an event that causes compromised coping skills and coping mechanisms. So when we experience a crisis that causes significant trauma, we are not able to function as we normally would. So those go-to coping skills that maybe we have learned and mastered in the past, they kind of go out the window. We're just not able to think through that process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a little bit. Next slide. So the goals of crisis intervention, these are things that we all want to strive for, we all want to try to accomplish. And probably the number one thing is to restore the situation to prevent any further deterioration. So we want to, at the very, very least, restore that individual to a pre-crisis level of functioning, whatever we need to do to try to make that happen. In that process, we want to help promote growth and effective problem-solving skills. We want to recognize any danger to prevent negative outcomes. Some examples of that would be, because of the trauma or because of the crisis, are we having students that are experiencing more depression? Are they having suicidal ideations? Are they engaging in risky type of behavior because they're not knowing how to cope any other way? All our attempts to take back control that they feel or they perceive that they've lost due to the crisis, we want to reinstate safety. We need to make sure that our students and our community members, our faculty, our staff feel like that they're safe. When a student goes to school, that space becomes their home for the time that they're in school. And that needs to be a safe place. They need to know that they are going to be able to go to school and have that reasonable expectation of safety. So we want to do whatever we can do to restore that safety for them. They need those basic needs of security, of shelter, safety from physical harm. All of those things have to be met before the student can ever go back into a learning type environment. The steps to protect people and secure the school, those are going to vary from crisis to crisis. So if you're working with a student who is having suicidal ideations, that crisis intervention is going to look much different than if you've had a mass school shooting or if you've had a bomb threat at your school. So all of that is going to come to play with your team in particular on what your team's policies and procedures and things are, because those types of intervention measures do change from crisis to crisis. Next slide. Understanding trauma. Like I said earlier, we can't really talk about crisis without talking about trauma. They go hand in hand. When an individual experiences trauma or a crisis, there are dramatic changes that happen in the brain. And these changes affect the way that the brain functions. So under normal circumstances, we're able to manage our emotions and we're able to plan ahead and we're able to think through and reason through things. But when we are experiencing a crisis or significant trauma, we're not able to plan ahead like we would normally. We're not able to manage our emotions or to reason through things. All of these things are primarily handled in the prefrontal lobe of the brain, and that's not fully developed until you're in your young adult ages. In women, they say the prefrontal cortex of the brain isn't fully developed until they're somewhere between 23 to 24 years old. And in men, it's a little bit longer, 24 to 26 years old. So when you're working with the ages of the students that you all are working with, you're dealing with a couple of things. One is that their brain is not fully developed and fully mature yet. So it's going to be much more difficult for them to understand and comprehend a crisis situation and how to react in that crisis situation. Because when our brains are, those functions are degraded because of the hormones that are being released into our body during trauma, it makes it much more difficult to do things that we would normally do. We wouldn't be able to manage our emotions and we wouldn't panic. We would be able to plan ahead and know that if we did this, that this outcome would happen. And when we experience trauma, that's not always the case. Stress and trauma causes the amygdala, which is the fear center in our brain, to fire, and adrenaline in high amounts is released into our body. That adrenaline can actually degrade some of the brain functions. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a bit. The ability of the prefrontal lobes, the hippocampus, to manage normal brain activity has been degraded when this happens. Next slide. So when we talk about crisis and we talk about trauma, I get very excited when we talk about this part of the presentation. I've pulled a few of these slides from a training that I do with law enforcement, neurobiology of trauma type training that I do with law enforcement to help them understand the changes that happen in our brain. So the image on the screen shows us three main organs in the brain. It shows us the hippocampus, which is the elongated teal organ. And the hippocampus is where all of our memory and all of our learning take place. We have the amygdala, which is the peach kind of pink colored circular organ behind the eye socket. That's the fear center of the brain. That's where the adrenaline is stored. That's where all of our survival skills are stored. That's where our emotional memory is kept. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part, this part of the brain. And this is where the decision making happens. This is where our impulse control happens. This is where our working memory happens. So when we break this part of the brain down and we look at these things and we think about, okay, this part of the brain isn't fully developed till later in life. So it's not unusual to see young people make poor decisions normally. It's not unusual to see young people have very impulsive behavior or to not have very clear working memory. But when this part of the brain, A, is not fully developed yet, and B, has been degraded because of a high amount of hormone release, it makes it much more difficult for them to make good decisions, to not have impulsive behavior, to not panic in those types of situations. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the brain and the hormonal response to trauma, we've got 4 main hormones that we work with. One is a catecholamine, and that's just a big fancy word for adrenaline. So the adrenaline, which is in the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, triggers that fight or that flight type trauma response. So the more adrenaline that is dumped into our body, we're either going to try to run away from a situation or we're going to try to fight our way out of a situation. We also have an oxytocin that is released in high amounts during stress or crisis in our lives. And the oxytocin promotes a good feeling, which might seem a little counterintuitive. If we are experiencing significant crisis or significant trauma, why would we want a hormone in our body that's going to promote a good feeling? We need that because that help mitigates and that help balances out these other hormones. We have cortisol, which obviously we need because it provides energy. So we need high levels of cortisol to be able to fight or to be able to run away, to be able to survive that crisis or to survive that trauma. And then we have opioids, which are a natural pain blocker in our body. If we have too much of the opioid in our body, which is going to block not just physical pain, but emotional pain and psychological pain, we're going to need to have a higher level of oxytocin to help balance that out and to help mitigate that pain. The best example that I can use when we talk about this is if anybody's ever taken too much cold medicine or they've had too much NyQuil and they feel very disconnected and they're not able to focus and just feel very groggy and fuzzy the next morning. It's a very similar situation. Or if you've had a significant adrenaline rush, it takes a little bit of time for those hormones to come back down to a baseline. So all of this is happening in our brain, and these hormones are being released into our body. And because these things are happening, those things in our brain that we would normally be able to handle, like our working memory, like our emotional memory, like our being able to reason through things and our thought process, and all of those things are severely degraded because of the levels of hormones that are being dumped into our bodies during a traumatic or a crisis type event. There's another trauma response phenomenon. There are 2 actually that I want to talk about. One is called tonic immobility. And tonic immobility is essentially trauma-induced paralysis. So if you ever work with a student or an individual that has experienced a traumatic incident, whether that be having suicidal ideations, attempting suicidal, a sexual assault, anything like that, the death of a family member or a friend or a faculty, anything like that, they may explain some of these phenomenons to you. They may say that they just didn't, let's use a school shooting for an example. A very chaotic situation, people are running in all different directions. They maybe couldn't move. Maybe they couldn't run away. Maybe they couldn't call for help. All of these things are a very normal and natural response to trauma, and everyone is going to respond differently to crisis and trauma based on their past experiences. But tonic immobility is very easily described as trauma-induced paralysis. We see that here at the Rape Crisis Center quite often when we're working with victims of sexual violence. Because of the amount of hormones that are being released into their body, they physically are not able to move their arms and legs. They're not able to call for help. They are experiencing a type of paralysis because of the trauma that they are experiencing. This paralysis can last just during the event. It can last after the event. However long it takes before the body no longer perceives that threat as death being imminent. I'm sorry about that. As long as the threat is there, the body is going to think that it's going to die. So that type of freeze response is going to be into play. We know that when we work with victims of sexual violence, that if they have been victims of sexual violence in the past, they're 50% more likely to experience this type of a freeze response to trauma. We also know that collapsed immobility is another very common response to trauma. This is simply when the individual slips in and out of consciousness, and they may only be able to recall bits and pieces of the experience that they happened. So if we have experienced something like a traumatic, possibly a fatality car accident, the victim of that accident may only be able to remember bits and pieces. Maybe they can remember getting in the car, and then maybe they can remember putting on their seatbelt and possibly hearing a horn honk, but they don't remember the screeching of the tires or the actual crash itself. And then they'll remember being in the ambulance or something along those lines. So again, when we work with victims of sexual assault, we see this collapsed immobility quite a bit, because this is a way that the body is protecting itself. They simply slip in and out of consciousness as a protective measure. And again, it's all due to the hormone releases that are happening during the crisis or during the trauma. Hillary has a video on here, and this is a comical video. It is the best way to explain this trauma response collapsed immobility. Many times amusement park rides literally scare people to death. Haunted houses scare people to death. You always hear people say those types of things. And what's happening is that the body is actually slipping in and out of consciousness. And this video describes this phenomenon better than anything that I could do to describe it. It's a very short video. If you have audio, you might want to turn it up a little bit so you can kind of hear the comments that are happening back and forth between the young man and the young woman on this amusement park ride. Hillary, if you'll go ahead and play that video for me.
There's a huge fundraising deadline coming up for Senate Democrats, and they need your help right now if they're going to.
Oh my God, you're not seeing it?
I think I'm worried about the shoes, actually.
Take it.
Okay.
You said you weren't seeing the video?
I was not seeing it.
Okay, all right, give me just a second. Can you see it now?
Perfect, thank you.
Or loose shoes.
All right, guys, here we go in 5, 4, 3,
No.
2, 1! And that's what it sounds like, okay? You know I play too many games here.
Oh.
Oh my God!
Holy shit. I'm gonna throw it. Stop! Oh my God. Oh my God. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. Wait with the camera.
Are you good? I get this kick-ass view. All right.
No.
You okay?
No.
You did it.
That's it?
That's it. That's the whole thing.
That was awesome.
Hillary, you can go back to the slideshow.
It's sweet.
Okay, so that was probably the most perfect example of collapsed immobility. Basically what's happening again is that the hormones are being released in the body of that individual at such high levels that they just are not able to function normally. The ironic thing or the interesting thing about that is that that individual will have no memory that that has happened to them. So until he saw that YouTube video or his girlfriend pointed out to him that that happened, he didn't realize that was actually happening to him. So when we work with victims of significant trauma, there's typically a lot of victim blaming that takes place from the victim themselves, because they are very frustrated because they are not able to remember what is happening. So they're not able to sequence an event. It's not that they don't want to remember. It's not that they're making things up. It's simply that they're not able to remember because of what has happened to them. So challenging, it's very challenging to sequence an event. It's very challenging to put things into an order that makes sense. So this can look a little counterintuitive. It can look like maybe they're not always being truthful when they're trying to recount what has happened to them. A victim of trauma or a crisis is going to want to put things in order that makes sense to them. And a traumatic incident or a crisis type situation does not make sense. So it's very difficult to make sense of a senseless act, if you will. So many times they will try to just tell their story or work through what's happening to them in a way that makes sense to them. And it might not always be an accurate account of what's happened. So immediately after the trauma, the brain is still impacted by the increased hormones that have been released into the body. So the normal trauma reactions may not seem right. So if you've experienced a significant crisis, like a mass school shooting, and you have students that are not crying or are not hysterical, maybe they appear to be very sleepy, maybe they're laughing, maybe they don't have any emotions whatsoever, they seem very flat. Those are all very normal and very natural reactions because of this increased hormone release. So just because they're not responding in the way that we think or society thinks they should be responding to this crisis or to this trauma does not mean that they're not affected by it. I think probably the most important thing that I would like for everyone to get from this training is that understanding how the brain reacts during trauma should tell us how to best interact and engage with those individuals who have experienced that trauma or that crisis. And so when we know and we understand what that is really the core to trauma-informed care. And I don't feel like that we're able to truly service and truly get the right resources to individuals who have experienced crisis and trauma if we don't understand how trauma affects the brain and the body. Next slide, please. So we know that the impact of trauma can happen at many different times. It can happen during the actual event. It can happen immediately following the event. Individuals can be impacted by the crisis that they've experienced through post-traumatic stresses or responses to stress. There can be long-term side effects. And so that's why it's so important that we understand that when an individual, particularly a student or a young person, has experienced some type of significant crisis, that they may present at different points. They may come to you at different points. It may be immediately following the event. It may be a year later. They may come back to you and say, based on whatever happened to me, I'm really starting to re-experience things. I'm becoming more triggered, or different things are affecting me, and I'm not able to function normally, or I'm not able to get back to that pre-crisis state that I was before that trauma or that crisis happened to me. So this is why the importance of sleep is so good and how so important, and how it affects memory so much. So we want to make sure that anybody who has experienced a significant crisis, they get good restorative sleep. When we work with victims of sexual assault, after the assault, and before they're brought in for their intensive law enforcement interview, we want to make sure that they've had 24 to 48 hours of good sleep. But it can't just be 24 to 48 hours. It has to be good restorative sleep to help the body and the brain come back down and have all those hormones come back down to a baseline. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to process what has happened, and they're not going to be able to move forward in their healing process. Next slide. So this may be some very basic information to all of you based on what you've been doing for years and years. You all are experts in your fields when it comes to different trauma responses for different age groups of students. But I did want to just break it down in case there was anybody that was newer to trauma work or to crisis work, and break it down by ages. So if you're working with children 0 to 5, these are some of the very common trauma responses that you may see. I have a picture up there, that's a happy picture, and that's not always the case. Sometimes art therapy is very good for the little ones to be able to express themselves because they don't have the words to express how they're feeling based on the crisis that they've experienced. So I'll go back to the story that I told at the beginning of the training about the September 11 incident, and in the days and weeks following September 11th, 18 years ago, I would have students come in, and they would come to class, and I could tell that they were very disheveled, that they hadn't slept, that they were very restless, and maybe they were crying, or they needed to be very close to me, or the pictures that they were drawing were somewhat disturbing based on what they had seen on television or what they had heard their parents talk about. And one little boy in particular came to me and said that he was really having bad nightmares. And we sat down and kind of unpacked what it was that he was feeling, and basically what he was seeing when he went to sleep every night were the bodies falling from the Twin Towers. And his parents were probably glued to the television screen, in their own trauma, in their own crisis, trying to process everything that was going on. And they weren't realizing that their child was also seeing these images and not knowing how to process that, not knowing how to respond to that. That was manifesting itself into either night terrors or, bad dreams, nightmares, those types of things. So these are some very common responses for this age group that you would see based on significant crisis or trauma. Next slide. The 6 to 11-year-olds have some of the same types of responses to trauma. They may start to experience some aggressive behavior. Maybe they're starting to act younger than they actually are. Sleep disorders are kind of across the board. Being withdrawn or poor school performance, experiencing some depression. Those are kind of across the board for all the age groups that we work with. But with this age group, you start to see some things like aggressive behavior or disobedience, conflict with siblings, maybe with their classmates and things like that, some peer type issues. And then the next slide talks about the 12 to 17-year-olds. And these, much like some of the other behaviors that you see in the younger children, you start to see more isolation, more depression and sadness, maybe some suicidal ideations. They start to engage in some more risky behavior and those types of things. So these are all common, very common trauma responses for these different types of age groups. And I think it's important that you are at least aware of those. So if you have students that come to you, or if you have other faculty members that bring things to your attention based on any of these common responses, you'll know kind of how to work with the student and what to do to help them move forward and to move through that crisis and to begin to heal again. Next slide. So crisis intervention, this is kind of what this training is all about. What is our plan of action going to be for crisis intervention? So I think the most important thing is to always try to use a trauma-informed approach. So the more we understand how the brain and the body is responds to crisis and trauma, the better we can work with these individuals and engage in these individuals. These are just some tips that we have found to be very, very helpful when we're working with individuals in crisis. Not asking the why questions are very important, because when we ask why questions immediately place blame. And they did not do anything to cause this crisis to happen to them. They did not do anything to cause them to have experienced this type of trauma. So when we start asking why questions, that does create some self-blame. Just changing the way that you're wording things and that you're thinking about things, instead of asking an individual who is experiencing trauma or has been through a crisis what's wrong with them, which also indicates that they have done something to cause something to be wrong with them, if that makes sense. Ask them what happened to them. That changes the whole dynamic of that question. And they may be more willing to open up to you if you're asking them what happened as opposed to what's wrong. Use I and we instead of you. It creates a team approach, and it gives them the sense that they are not alone in this and that they have people that are going to be there to walk with them through these dark places and spaces. Involve the person in any decisions that you're making as much as possible, because remember, this trauma and this crisis has happened to them. So they should be involved in what that plan looks like. Be proactive. Try to prevent escalation of the situation if that's possible. Watch for any beginning signs of agitation or any type of unusual behavior. It's much better to intervene sooner rather than later. Try to take a breath and slow things down. How well do you know the person? Is there somebody else who may know this student better? Maybe they've built a relationship or a rapport with them, and you could bring them in that team approach and talk to the student. I know when I taught school, I had, because I taught special ed, mild, moderate behavior disorders, I had students on occasion that would melt down, and I would need to be very cognizant of making sure that I was watching for those beginning signs of agitation or any type of unusual behavior, and knowing how important it was to try to intervene as soon as we started to see those things, so it did not escalate and get out of hand. Next slide. So as far as the plan of action is concerned, there are many other things that we can do. We want to keep in mind our personal space. I'm sure that I'm no different than anyone else, and I don't like folks up in my personal space. It makes me feel uncomfortable. And if somebody is going through some sort of a crisis type situation, or they've experienced significant trauma, they do not want anybody in their personal space. So be very mindful of that. This type of personal space does change when somebody is in crisis. You need to be very aware of body language and of certain nonverbal cues as you approach. Ask as you're approaching. Ask before you sit. Again, including them in decisions, no matter how small they are. Even something as small as just saying, can I sit down next to you? Or do you mind if I walk up to you? That can make all the difference in the world, because that tells them that you are there with them in that moment. So how are you presenting yourself? What does your body language look like? Does your body language match your words? What's your nonverbal body language looks like? Are you sitting with your arms crossed in front of you in a very closed off posture? Or are you in more of an open type posture? Be very careful of touch. We know that when we work with victims of sexual violence, many times all you want to do is just hug that person and try to hug them and squeeze them and squeeze their pain out of them. That's not going to happen. You need to be very mindful and very aware of approaching anybody too quickly, of touching anyone without asking for permission. Make sure that you take the time and you get down to eye level. It's always best to sit down next to somebody face to face and be able to talk through what's going on with them. Introduce yourself, use your first name if you can. Ask them what their name is and use it often. When you're working with somebody who is in a crisis type state, an agitated type state, it's very helpful to use their first name and use it as often as you can. Next slide. So this is a little bit more of kind of leading up to de-escalation type skills and things like that. So when you're working with students that have experienced significant crisis and you're not sure how they are going to be reacting, it may be positive, it may be negative, and a lot of that has to do with their past life experiences and things that are going on with them personally. But you need to know all of your exit routes. You need to know which doors are available to you, which windows are open, do a quick scan of the area, and not just for obvious weapons. You want to look around your space and think about things that may not be obvious. A stapler is a weapon. The receiver of a phone is a weapon. Anything that a student who is in an agitated state can get their hands on can be used as a weapon. So think outside the box and just make sure that you're taking care of yourself and you're scanning the area so you know your own escape routes and you also know what is in the area. Always be calm, always be reassuring. Be very aware of not talking down to someone. Use active listening skills. Don't assume that you know what's bothering this individual, because the crisis or the trauma that's right in front of you that you're dealing with right there may not be the only thing that they're dealing with. So it's so, so important to listen, to understand, and not to respond. And when I train law enforcement, I say that multiple times during the training, because so many times we want to immediately respond to whatever that individual is saying, instead of actually listening to understand. Because when we respond too quickly, what we are saying might make perfect sense to us, but what that individual is hearing is, you're not listening to me. You're not hearing me, because you're too worried about responding. So please take the time to listen to understand and not just to respond. Stay in control of your own emotions and be honest about the situation. If this is upsetting to you, be honest about that. If this is a scary situation, it's okay to acknowledge that. I think it's important that we're very honest when we're working with students who have experienced trauma or crisis and could potentially be in an agitated state. Next slide. So signs of increased agitation. There are some very common signs, some very go-to telling signs that we have. Things like clenching of the jaw or clenching of the fists are very common. We see that a lot when we talk about increased agitation. There's a wild look in someone's eyes, or they have that 1,000-yard stare, and you can tell that they're just out of touch with reality. They can be speaking very loudly. Now, just because an individual is speaking loudly does not necessarily mean that that's a sign of an increased agitation. It could just mean that they're not completely aware of their spatial surroundings. But if it becomes verbally abusive, if they're not respecting either physical or emotional or verbal boundaries, that's definitely a red flag. If they start to have very quick or erratic movements, or if they stop talking and moving altogether, then those are things that you need to be very aware of. Knocking things over, tipping over desks, throwing chairs, those are all very obvious ones. But it's the ones that maybe are not as obvious that you need to be mindful of, like if they suddenly stop talking or stop moving. Next slide. Verbal de-escalation strategies are really important when you're working with a student that may be agitated. If there are no weapons present, then verbal de-escalation strategies are very appropriate to try to use. So if the individual is becoming verbally abusive or defensive to you, don't mirror that. Don't become verbally defensive back. Be empathetic to the feeling, not the behavior. That's really important. You do need to be respectful, and you need to be firm, and you need to identify and understand the behavior. But it's important to be empathetic to the way the individual is feeling, not necessarily that behavior that they're exhibiting. Don't ignore them. Just avoid comments like, I need you to relax. I need you to calm down. I know how you feel. Think back to your own lives and back to your own personal experiences. And how many of you can honestly say when you're upset and somebody tells you to calm down, that causes you to calm down? That does absolutely the opposite for me if somebody tells me to calm down when I'm upset. So those types of things, what we're saying and what we're meaning, sometimes are vastly different than what they're hearing or what they're thinking. So just try to remember those types of things. Don't talk over the individual. Don't get loud. If their voice starts to escalate, bring yours down a little bit. That will help calm them down. That will help ground them. You can do grounding exercises with them, breathing exercises. Ask them to identify 4 things in the room that they can see, 2 things that they can hear, 1 thing that they can touch. All of these things are grounding exercises that kind of help bring somebody down. You need to be patient. This crisis didn't happen instantly. Well, it may have happened instantly, but the way that they're feeling kind of built up over time. So be patient, be respectful, be firm, and take control over your own anxiety. Because when you are anxious, that can make somebody who is already in an agitated state feel even more anxious and overwhelmed. And things can escalate very quickly when that starts to happen. Next slide, please. So the physical aspect of verbal de-escalation skills. A lot of these are going to be very common knowledge, but I do want to go over them briefly. It's important that you don't turn your back or to get yourself cornered when you're dealing with somebody who is showing signs of aggression. Keep that individual at eye level. Allow extra space. If you have a desk in between you, or if you have a bookshelf in between you, make sure that you have some extra space in between you when you're working with somebody who is showing or exhibiting signs of aggression. I said maintain or be at eye level, but don't maintain constant eye contact. Many times constant eye contact can come across as being a threatening behavior, and we certainly don't want the individual to feel any more threatened than they're already feeling. Smiling can also be perceived as mocking or threatening behavior. So kind of keep that in mind. Pointing your finger or shaking your finger at somebody, again, is never a good idea. Be aware of your own body language. And obviously, if the aggression becomes a situation that you can't handle, or you feel that the aggression is becoming more aggressive than you're able to verbally de-escalate, then obviously you need to go ahead and call for emergency services. Next slide. There are a lot of indicators to predict physical violence when you're working with someone that may be exhibiting signs of aggression. So we have some internal factors that we want to talk about. There are certain internal factors that have been linked to aggressive behavior. So if the person is afraid, if they felt humiliated, if they feel immense grief or a sense of powerlessness, if they become embarrassed or challenged, or even if they're just bored, they can become very aggressive. We also know that there's some actual physical factors that can lead to violence and to aggression. So if an individual has a lack of sleep, if they are physically or emotionally exhausted, if they're too hot or they're too cold, if they're hungry, if they've used some sort of a substance, whether that be drugs or alcohol, or if they are physically in pain and it's chronic pain that just never goes away. Those physical features can also lead to a violent, aggressive type of behavior. Next slide. So situational factors can also lead to this. So the individuals that you're working with, the students that you're working with, do they have access to weapons? How many individuals have weapons in the home that maybe are not locked up and secured properly? So are they able to bring those to school with them in their backpacks? Are you working with an individual or a student that's experienced some type of childhood abuse or aggression at home or in the school? Maybe they're feeling bullied at school, or they're experiencing some type of domestic violence or sexual violence in the home. Are they feeling some sense of being oppressed, or that they've experienced some type of injustice in some way, or some type of hopelessness? All of these can be situational factors, which can also go hand in hand with our internal factors and our physical factors that can be contributing factors to aggressive behavior. Next slide, please. Some things to remember that when you're working with students that may be exhibiting aggressive behavior because of a crisis or after a crisis or due to the trauma they've experienced, or it's important to remain calm. You can look calm on the outside and be scared to death on the inside, and that's perfectly okay. I feel like that we've all, those of us who've done this type of work, we've all experienced situations to where we may have looked calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but we've been a bundle of nerves on the inside. Let them know that you want to hear their side of things, because that's important. It empowers them. It lets them know that you are there to actually try to understand what it is that they're going through. Be respectful. Divert their attention if you need to. If a situation arises or if their behavior changes dramatically, try to divert that attention in a different, more positive way. Let them vent if they need to. Remember that underlying issues probably exist. So even if the crisis and the trauma is something that you're working through right then and there may be other things that have compiled on that they may be dealing with. Unfortunately, nothing works 100% of the time. So a lot of this is trial and error, but you need to remember that your safety and their safety is your #1 priority. And if they need the help that you're not able to provide, that you know where to go and what to do based on the school's policies and procedures on how to move forward with that aspect of things. Next slide. So this part of the presentation is all about you and what you're doing for you. Vicarious trauma and who is taking care of you. So the work that you do is very hard. What you see day in and day out can become very overwhelming. Especially during the times that we're in now with this pandemic and the uncertainty and our kiddos not knowing what's going to happen and not knowing if they're always going to have to wear a mask or if somebody that they care about is going to get sick, especially the young ones that just aren't able to process everything that's going on. So a lot of what we hear, a lot of what we see during our work just becomes a part of us. We're able to we're not able to leave it at work. We're not able to detach ourselves from it. So it can become a part of us. And that's what vicarious trauma is. And so we're all affected. We're affected because of what we see and what we hear every day and what we can't fix. Many, many times it was so difficult to know that a student was going to go home hungry, that a student was not going to have a safe place to sleep overnight, or that they were going to come to school in the same clothes that they wore the day before, or their basic needs weren't being met. And some of that we just can't fix. And that becomes very frustrating. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, because the work that you do is very hard. Next slide. So there are a lot of risk and vulnerability factors involved in the work that you do. Some of those professional risks can simply be feeling overworked and overwhelmed, feeling very isolated in the work that you do, a lack of professional support, too many negative clinical outcomes. Maybe you just, as counselors, you're just seeing student after student after student who is in distress, who is struggling, who is feeling very vulnerable. And that can become very overwhelming for you. Or you can just have very high caseloads. Next slide. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we don't become too stressed out, and that doesn't lead to burnout. Most commonly seen with vicarious trauma is emotional exhaustion, a diminished personal accomplishment, starting to become cynical, impaired attention to work details, and increased irritability. So these are things that you can watch out in yourself, you can watch out for in your colleagues, and if you start to see those things happen, then maybe a conversation needs to be happened. Maybe some self-care plans need to be enacted to make sure that these things are not happening to you. And this is critically important after a crisis type intervention. So if you were to be deployed, these are things that you would really want to start to watch for after that deployment, when you come back and you have your debriefings and you have your discussions about what happened and what went well, what didn't work well, what can we do to make things better for ourselves and our students in the future. And I particularly like this graphic because stress is desserts spelled backwards. And if you're anything like me, desserts always seem to help. Next slide. Self-care is very important. I can't stress that enough. The work that you do is very difficult. Your physical well-being, these are some things that you can do for your physical well-being, your fitness, your nutrition, rest. Annual medical checkups are so very important. Your social connections are very important. So your families and your friends, your work support, and importantly is non-working activities. So be sure that you're experiencing some things in your life that don't have to do with the type of work that you do. That's really important. Your psychological well-being. How are you managing your stress? How are you managing your emotional support, your spiritual support? All those things are going to help you take care of yourself, especially after a crisis type situation. Next slide. So this is the conclusion. We've got an opportunity for some questions and answers. I see that there's a couple questions in the chat box, but I just want to kind of conclude by saying that your safety is first and foremost. Be very confident in your skills. You're always adding tools to your tool belt. So new things come out all the time about crisis intervention, about becoming more trauma-informed and victim-centered, and knowing that there's information out there, knowing that you can always give us a call. My email address is out there, our telephone number is out there. Lifelines isn't just the Rape Crisis Center, and it isn't just outreach and education, but we have divisions that help with many different types of resources. So if you have students or faculty or staff that may be in need of any type of counseling, family counseling, individual counseling, helping children cope and deal with divorce, any type of financial counseling, identity theft. We have programs that work with children to make sure that they're meeting their developmental milestones. So anything like that, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, because we may have something that can help you assist the individuals that you're working with. And if we don't know what that is, we can always rely on our United Way 211 resource guide, and hopefully we'll be able to find those materials for you. So now we have some time to take any questions, if there are any questions.
I know somebody asked a minute ago, will there be a copy of the PowerPoint? We have been recording this, so as soon as that's available, I can get that sent to Monica, and she can share that with anybody who needs it.
And I'm always happy to share all my resources. So if there's ever anything that you heard in the PowerPoint that you want some more information on, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to share any of those resources. Well, thank you, Tammy. And I didn't see the name before Tammy's comment, but thank
Like
you.
Tanya was saying, it was a really great presentation. So thank you, Tanya.
The interesting thing about this presentation, and I failed to mention it in the beginning, and I probably should have done that, is that I was mindful in how I presented it because I see crisis and trauma through a different lens, and that is through the lens of a sexual assault advocate. But I also, based on my experience as a school teacher myself, I am able to kind of see it through that type of lens as well. And I just think it's important that we, more than anything, that we know and we understand how our brain and our body reacts to crisis and trauma, because that really does help us understand how to best engage and how to best come up with a good, not just safety plan, but a plan moving forward for healing for anyone that's experienced that.
If it's okay, I'd love to share a personal experience I had dealing with a crisis one-on-one with a teacher, which might be helpful or just a little something to think about. Whenever I was in 6th grade, the first person that I disclosed my sexual assault to, aside from my friend who encouraged me to come forward about it, was actually my favorite English teacher. And I went to her and I let her know, and I mean, she was wonderful. She was so supportive. The only thing is she didn't tell me that because she was a mandated reporter that she was going to have to tell my parents. So all of a sudden, my parents are coming up to the school to pull me out, and they're freaking out, and I had no idea that they knew. So that caused a lot of like stress and worry. Whereas if she would have told me that, hey, I appreciate you coming forward and letting me know about this, I am going to have to let your parents know because I have an obligation to do so. And also I think it would be good for them to know so that they can support you whenever you leave school. I think that definitely would have been a big help. So just being honest with your students and letting them know what your limitations are and your obligations. So that way, whenever they do come to you with a personal situation, they do know that it's a safe space, but you do have an obligation and responsibility to let proper authorities or people know.
That's a good point. Thank you for sharing that, Hillary. Are there any other questions or Hillary, are there any comments in the chat box? There's a 7 down there.
I see a lot of thank yous, which we appreciate that. We're glad that everybody enjoyed it. Other than that, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, again, if you come up with any questions later, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I would just like to end one by thanking Dr. Motley very much for the opportunity to be able to share this information. I hope that you did find some of it helpful and to be able to, take away and use in your everyday life. One thing that I want to end in is when we're working with people who are in crisis and have experienced significant trauma, they don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. And I think that that's a really important thing to remember and a good way to end this presentation. So thank you all very much, and we hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Oh my goodness, that was absolutely wonderful and excellent information. We appreciate it, Laury, and thank you, Hillary, for sharing your personal example with us. And it's a reminder. I know we've all been to, we've had the graduate training, but a lot of times we definitely need to have the reminders about some of the ways that we can help during a crisis situation. And this presentation was absolutely excellent in reminding us the best way that we can help to de-escalate and to support our students, faculty, and staff during a crisis. I was taking notes, and I'm so thank you for recording it too, providing the recording, because I will share that out with our crisis intervention team. Thank you. We appreciate you sharing your resources with us and sharing your knowledge and expertise.
Well, thank you, Dr. Motley, for everything that you and your team do as well.
Thank you. You all have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thank you.